Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Brandon, for providing your presentation. So this evening's presentation is being provided by Brandon Francis. He is the Education Resource Coordinator at the New Mexico State University Farmington Ag Science Center. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Brandon. We'll go ahead and turn the screen over to you.
Oh, yeah, Shay Brandon William Francis in the not often add touching in Schlim, though Toso Nibasachin, Twitchini Dashe, Ketlichini Dashanala, I see just Jane then Nasha, Shelchina 8 Hope, with Bilashla Ishla. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It seems like we're about to get some rain here, hopefully in Farmington. And I want to thank everybody for inviting me to give this presentation. It's something I get to do this time of year, is identify a lot of the various diseases that plants are going through. And for the people in San Juan County, like Jesse said, I'm the Education Resource Coordinator at the NMSG Agricultural Science Center in Farmington, New Mexico, located by NAPI. It was started in the late 60s and early 70s to help the Navajo people get to help them use their access to the river, make it so they can put their water rights to beneficial use. So the Agricultural Science Center was started to help NAPI grow, but now NAPI is a $1 million industry, but we still assist them in a lot of ways. And this footage I got going now is this was taken on site at the Agricultural Science Center, which is about 185 acres that we get to work. And here's the combine harvesting some grain for various grain trials that we get to do at the station. And for my capacity, I'm the Education Resource Coordinator this year for the Diego Gardening Project, which is teaching 3rd to 5th grade students about gardening and healthy eating, which is part of a study to see the effect having a garden as well as garden-based and healthy eating curriculum have on the behavior. And also I get to go out whenever someone has a question in the community about their plants or about their soil or about their water. I get to go out there and I get to go into the community and address those needs. And if I don't have the answer, because sometimes a lot of things are beyond the scope of what we can help with, and disease identification, as you will see, is something very, very tricky. And so I was just showing you some shots of the Agricultural Science Center, and the experiment station where I work at, we even there we run into problems. And as you can see, this is some potatoes that are getting we just noticed this past week that were coming down with some early blight. And this is a problem that we run into, especially in the organic section of the plot, where organic meaning we don't apply herbicide, fungicide, or even fertilizer. We like to observe them under their natural conditions of growing. So even us experts at the Science Center, we have to deal with these problems. And this is just one of the pictures I like to show that we took this past week, and helping people deal with it. And all this has to be destroyed. And that's one of the things when you come across this, is that it's easy to spread these from field to field. So you have to be careful if you see something like this going on in one part of your your garden or your farm, not to spread it to other parts or even to spread it to other people's field. So it's always best to change your clothes and disinfect even your shoes, because spreading this is very, very easy. And there's various ways to spread it, and it's just not by human contact. And another thing I like to show is the difficulty of plant disease identification. And disease identification, it's not always viral. It can be fungal, and it can also be nutrient deficiencies. And usually, when I give presentations like this, I usually the previous slide I have them. I ask them the question: can anyone tell me what's wrong with this plant? And I usually have them identify the plant. And people are like potato, and I always ask them, what's wrong with it? And then they give them a little familiarity with it. Then I show them this picture of some corn, and I always tell them that it's not a viral infection, it's not a bacterial infection, it's not a fungal infection. It's something is going wrong in the nutrient uptake of the plant, and that all goes back to soil and water and even sunlight, how much sunlight it gets, and even the genetics of the seed. So this picture I'm showing right now just shows corn, which is going through some nitrogen deficiency. And corn, for those growers out there, are very familiar with the uptake of corn. Corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder, which means it takes up a lot of nitrogen from the soil. So if you don't practice a beneficial crop rotation, or even amend your soil year after year, you're going to run into nutrient deficiencies, such as this corn, which is exhibiting nitrogen deficiency. And this is something you'll commonly see in the field. And when I'm giving this presentation, I always ask people, what's wrong with this plant? It looks very similar to what's going on here. And that just goes to show you the difficulty in diagnosing various plant disorders. And this one is exhibiting potassium deficiency. And people here in the San Juan River Valley, they do crop rotate. They usually do like 3 years of corn, 2 years of corn, then switch it over to an alfalfa. And that usually returns the nitrogen to the soil. But one thing that alfalfa takes out of the soil is potassium. So this plant right here, this corn right here, is exhibiting potassium deficiency, and it's very similar looking to the nitrogen deficiency. So, and this other one, this third picture of this corn, and they all look very similar. There's very, very small signs that they're different. This third one is exhibiting zinc deficiency. So that just goes to show you how hard it is to diagnose plants unless you've been around them. And that's one thing about growing, is that you go out to your garden, you go out into your field, and you watch your plants, you get to know them and observe them. You'll know over time when they're exhibiting different characteristics like these, and you'll know how to fix it over time. So these are the physiological diseases for corn. This is just various deficiencies, such as nitrogen deficiencies, as I mentioned before. And there's also phosphorus, and there's also, like I mentioned, potassium, sulfur, and zinc. And they have various symptoms or markers that you can see when they're exhibiting them. And they're very telltale signs, and they're very fixable, very fixable. And this is a picture that people always, we have a poster of this at the station, just to show you that there are the plants let us know when they're going through these things that are hard on them. And it's not always a viral or bacterial infection or a fungus, but when it is a bacterial infection, the striping or the how it looks will be very, very different. And all these pictures are when they're in the early stages of it. And these diseases, they just don't affect corn. Like I mentioned before, they they can come from other plants and they can spread to other plants. And how you manage something like this, which is the bacterial leaf blight, and there's several different types. But this one, I recommends that growing resistant varieties. That's why it's good to save your seed year after year, because plants at a genetic level, they remember stress factors that they go through, and they become more and more resistant the more you grow them in an area. And if your plants are exhibiting this, you can plow that crop into the soil, and it might not be very effective because corn is not the only host of this bacteria. So you got to be very careful when managing these things. And another bacterial infection is bacterial stalk rot or soft rot, and this is very common with not very common here, but very common if you have overhead irrigation systems or an area with heavy rainfall, and high humidity. So because there's ways to manage these things, and there's ways to mitigate what's going on, is to have well draining soil and not having your plants just sit in water. But for here in the Four Corners, it's not really that big of a problem depending on the irrigation. And I also like to talk about fungal infections. And this one, as you can see, is very common, and it's just not common in corn. But corn is something that we grow here, and it's very common. So I'd like to talk about various diseases that are common to the crops that we grow in here. And the fungus can survive over winter, so it can survive. The infected plants can still carry the disease, and it likes high temperatures and extended wet periods. And like I mentioned before, rotating your crops and plowing in your into your soil. It's very important to get rid of crops that you notice that are infected, and noticing that they're going through the early stages before it can spread to your other plants. So watching your plants and being in symbiosis with them, and knowing when they're going through a hard time is very important as a farmer and as a grower. And this one is gray leaf spot, and this one is when you don't crop rotate, and when people don't use as much tillage, it's better to just get rid of the early crops like this. But I always tell people that it's spraying or using chemicals should always be a last resort. But things like this, they are what people recommend is to actually spray fungicide on diseases like this, and becoming familiar with their plants and knowing when they exhibit these characteristics is very important. And this is another common one because it's spread by the wind, and corn growers know that it doesn't really affect the yield of the plant, but it does affect the growth of it, because anything that's inhibiting growth, it'll just take longer and longer, and your plants won't be as vibrant. And another plant I like to talk about, and something that's very common, comes up at workshops, is powdery mildew. And this, even though it's not very humid here, and people do come across a lot of powdery mildew, and that's one of the common questions is, how do I deal with this? And because people, they either are scared to use fungicides on it, and and they're not familiar with its application. But what I always recommend to people is remove plants that you notice that they're coming down with a powdery mildew, and try not to water. If you're watering, try not to water and let your plants sit in water. It's better to water at the root level and not to have them get overwatered and saturated with water. And here's the one that um, is very common in the area as well, which is blossom end rot. Not it not only affects tomatoes, but it also affects watermelons and other plants similar to it. And what the prevention and treatment that people recommend is always to understand your pH level of your soil of your region and know if you have alkaline soil or very acidic soil. But also another cause um, of blossom end rot is that people add excessive fertilizer and potassium when they're amending the soil. And when you add too much of this, it interferes with the uptake of calcium of the plant when they're building their cellular structures. And so when it says right here, it says when the plants are dark green, and they're usually very healthy plants. So you don't need to fertilize. And so over fertilizing, it interferes with that calcium uptake that your plants are going through. So the problem is that um, if you're having problems with calcium, is what I use in our garden, our backyard garden, is we use eggshells, and just not fresh from breakfast eggshells. They kind of have to be composted and broken down um, over time, and that provides calcium for your plants. And people always they always recommend adding lime, but here in the Four Corners, our soil is already very alkaline, and it doesn't need to be adjusted. You can over adjust it and push your plants to the opposite end of the spectrum. And they even give irrigation recommendations, which is about 1 inch of irrigation water per week. And so, and also when you're cultivating is just a fancy word for when you're weeding. So you don't want to be pulling up roots really near your plant, because that all, as you probably know, all the plant roots, they're connected. So you can, when you're pulling up plants, be very careful pulling up plants near your plants, and you can damage them and make them very susceptible to the various diseases that the plants are going through. So, like I always recommend, um, anytime your plants are exhibiting any of the symptoms, you don't want you want to get rid of that plant that immediately before it infects the rest of your plants. And like I mentioned before, um, this time of year we get a lot of calls to the science center, and they're always asking us, "There's something wrong with my corn. My corn didn't grow," and or even, and we always tell them, send us a picture, and even going by the picture, it's always hard to tell without making a field visit. And I think it was 3 years ago, a tomato producer in the region gave us a call, and they were saying, my tomatoes aren't growing. It looks like they're shriveling up, and it looks like they're dying. I think they might have a disease, And so we went over. So well, we went over there, and sure enough, all the plants looked like they were wilty and curling up. And but usually, when a disease or some type of virus or enters your field, it won't affect your entire field all at once. So it usually affect one plant, and then extrapolate out after that to the nearest plant and more plants after that. So, but when we went to this farm, we noticed that all these plants were exhibiting this behavior, and that was the first time in San Juan County that the temperatures were over 100 degrees for a week, and this was three years ago. So all these plants, they were exhibiting, they were shriveling up and they were curling up, and to prevent themselves from dying in the extreme temperature. So all their stomas, their stomatas were closed up and they weren't transferring carbon. So it looked like they were dying, but they were just in defensive mode from the extreme temperatures that were there at the time. Now it's normal. We've become used to if we're getting over 100-degree temperatures on a regular basis now. But that was the first time it happened. And so, and that the disease that they were worried about having is actually spread by these guys, leafhoppers. They're worried that their plants had curly top virus. And as you can see in the picture on the right, one plant is actually infected with this curly top virus. And the younger the plants are, the more susceptible they are to this disease, which is spread by the leafhoppers. And as you probably in the name there's the curly top virus is actually what happens to the leaves. They curl up and they shrivel up and they stop photosynthesizing, so the plant will essentially die. And as you can see in the picture, this plant is on its way out. And curly top virus is just like the other many of the other viruses. It just doesn't affect tomatoes. As you can see, it says beet curly top virus, but it also affects chilies and other plants. And spreading it is spreads by insects, going from one plant to another and transferring the virus to another plant. And the plants will not recover, and they will die, and it they'll just stop putting on fruit and stop flowering altogether. So be very aware. And just like I mentioned before, I'm not an expert, and but all my experience comes from actually being out in the field, and actually comes from watching the plants and learning all these things over time. And as farmers and as growers, it's a lifelong process. And agriculture is one of those fields and one of those areas of expertise where you're always learning. There's always going to be new things that come up. And when we spray pesticides, when we spray fungicides, the viruses and the diseases and even the insects, the pests that bother the plants, they become stronger and more adapted to the things that we spray on them. So spraying should always be a last resort, because we don't want to strengthen the next population of diseases and insects. But we live in a time where we have to grow on a big scale, and people who are growing on an industrial scale, they have to spray, and they have to spray for fungicides as a preventive measure. But at the Science Center, we like to when I first started working there, I didn't understand it till a couple months later. My boss, Dr. Kevin Lombard, told me, like, he said, you're in the business of killing plants and growing plants. And I didn't understand that at first, but what he meant by that was, when they grow stuff at the Agricultural Science Center, they want to grow them under the conditions that we have in the San Juan River Valley. So if someone like NAPI or someone like a large producer wants to go grow it on a bigger scale, we can actually show them that, oh, something unexpected happened, and this could happen if you grow it on a bigger scale. This is how much water we gave it, and these are the conditions it thrived in, and these are the pests that bothered it. These are the diseases that bothered it. And diseases can come from the soil. They can come from old plants that you have laying around. So those brush piles, not only are they they're hiding places for not only pests that carry diseases to your plants, but also for viruses that can linger over the winter and will reemerge in the spring. So what I always recommend is check out all the information out there on the internet. This is only a small portion of the information out there. This is the website to the NMSU Plant Clinic. This is where we send our stuff. Like that, I showed you that picture of the early blight in the potatoes. This is the place we send our stuff to, so they can accurately identify it for us and make sure that we identified it right. And there this week, we're almost 100% sure, maybe 95, that it's early blight. But then the experts, they'll find out and they'll know. So there's your extension office that can come and help you. And if you have any problems, and there's other farmers, because farming is a community, and you can learn from people who've been doing it for years, and they have a wealth of knowledge. And then there's also publications like this recent one with the chili peppers that was recently published about chili pepper diseases that are prevalent in New Mexico. But so there's extension agents, there's an experiment station that you can reach out to and help you with these problems. And they can give you the best recommendation that they know, but they can also punch in the right direction of people who really know, and they really are familiar with the subject, because it is a broad subject. And there was one thing I was going to include was things about trees, various viruses that affect trees. So it's a big field. And so here's my contact information. Like I mentioned before, I work at the NMSU Agricultural Science Center in Farmington. And not only do I do this, but I test soil for heavy metals, because I believe that not only is clean water, but also healthy soil makes for healthy plants and healthy animals and healthy people. So, and to end, I always like to tell a little story. And it's kind of related, but it goes back to plant identification. About 3 years ago, when we got a nice rainy season, might have been 2 years ago, we got a call from one of the council delegates, and they said that there was a plant that the cattle in Shiprock were eating. And by the time I got the word, I think it was 7 cows had passed away from eating something. And so I went out there and I looked around, and because I grew up on Black Mesa, Arizona, raising cows, horses, sheep, but I'm no expert. But I am familiar with with it. So I called in an expert, um, Arnold Clifford, who's a ethnobotanist from the area, and we drove around. We checked the watering holes, we checked the grazing areas, and lo and behold, it was larkspur, and which is not something endemic to the region. I mean, it is endemic, but it doesn't come back year after year. It kind of waits for a nice rainy season. So that rainy season, we saw stuff that we hadn't seen in over 30 years. And even farmers and seasoned ranchers were confused about what their animals were eating and dying. So um, what I always like to say is, as Navajo people, we have a saying that when you plant 4 times, because nature always takes its cut. The insects will take their cut, the animals will take their cut, nature will take its cut, and finally we'll take our cut. And to add to that, there's diseases out there, and if our plants are vulnerable from from our agricultural practices, that they'll take their cut. And unless we know and then have a vast knowledge of what we are getting ourselves into, we can ask other people, because agriculture is a community, and we're here to help each other. So eke and I will turn it back over for any questions.
I have a question for you, Brandon. Um, I know, well, the garden we have, it's running off of an artesian well. And there's a lot of, I don't know, anyhow, we watered the garden with it, and one part does good, but then there's probably a small portion that the plants only get so high, and that's as far as they grow. Do you know what it's lacking or what's going on with it?
Um, I always recommend that people get their soil tested, and if you can get a soil sample from the part that's doing extremely well, and then get a soil sample from the other part, and next time you're in Farmington, I can test it for you, and it could be, since your water is coming from the same source, probably something in the soil. And what were the plants that, or the native plants or the invasive plants that were in your area?
The plants, the invasive weeds, I guess, that are there is that nightshade, and then also some Russian thistle, but it doesn't affect them. But with the corn, that's where you see that it's not growing, but the others are growing. But in that area, I know we've been under, I guess, areas, corn that area. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I would do a soil test, but then there's other factors in play, like sometimes like plants like Russian knapweed, when you pull them up, they release a chemical. I can't think of the name off the bat, that kind of poisons the soil for like 5 years in that area. So it could be a variety of things, but next time you're in Farmington, bring your soil, and I can test it for you.
Okay, and I know in that area, when the water pulls up, that's where it sits, and that's where the plants are doing so well.
Yeah, that could be it. Drainage.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, if you guys have any questions, raise your hands. We'll unmute you, and then if not, go to the Q&A. All right. Well, I don't see any questions here on my end. Again, thank you, Brandon, for your presentation, and also always talk about it in our staff meetings. We enjoy your stories and learn a lot from you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, guys. Well, that concludes this evening's presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And join us next week. We will have Marcy Ward doing a replacement heifer selection. We'll have more information sent out. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
The Native American Producer Success Project, also known as NAPS, is a collaborative effort between Dene Inc., a nonprofit organization, New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, and Dene College Land Grant Office. The project is funded by USDA Office of Partnership and Public Engagement Outreach and Assistance for Social Disadvantage and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. The goals of the NATS project is to increase the profitability and long-term sustainability of the Navajo farmers and ranchers. To achieve this goal, activities in our 4 key areas are being undertaken to improve Navajo farm and ranch operations, increase the Navajo farm and rancher knowledge of the access to available programs and technical assistance provided by the United States Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Navajo Nation, the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, the Dene College Land Grant Office, and others. To strengthen the organizational capacity of the Navajo Farmer and Rancher Congress to address the current and future needs of Navajo farmers and ranchers, and to facilitate farmers and ranchers' use of the USDA, NRCS, FSA, and RMA programs.